Thank you very much, Dr. Harawa Rebi, for this opportunity to interact again. And I also wish to thank Professor Hamadi Boga, my recent colleague during my stay in Kenya, where I experienced and saw firsthand quite some significant policy reforms and policy reforms, which are very much in line with this session that we are going to speak to in the next 10 minutes. I wish to also thank the organizers of Africa Food Tech Expo for providing us this opportunity to talk on policies impacting food and agriculture in Africa. And as the introduction is said, my main role in all my working career in one way or the other has had something to do with public policy. So in my preamble, I would like to say that governments have the key responsibility of setting and formulating policies and regulations that are necessary for creating a conducive environment for the implementation of food and agriculture programs by the many actors. So my presentation briefly explores the major policy tools and instruments that are commonly at the disposal of governments to influence the performance of food systems based on my practical experience from African countries. When we talk of policy tools and instruments, we can give a simple example that a government may decide as a major policy that they want to promote utilization of fertilizer by farmers. But to get that to happen, you need the tools like a subsidy or an e-voucher system. So that's the distinction between policy and the tools and instruments that are used to make the policy work. We are also aware that there is general consensus that a well-performing agricultural sector is fundamental for Africa's overall economic growth, as well as reducing hunger, poverty, and inequality. Across the African continent, agricultural production and productivity and competitiveness remain low due to a mix of macroeconomic distortions, resource constraints, and natural hazards, as well as due to the fact that many countries are operating under typically weak, unpredictable, and counterproductive policy environments. Therefore, enhancing agricultural policy and policy formulation remains a key determining factor for achieving sustainable agricultural economic performance in the predominantly agriculture-based economies of Africa. Agricultural policies are affected and influenced by many factors, which include the general economy-wide policies, such as industrial policy, trade, and infrastructure policies, or the sector-specific policies that are within the agricultural sector itself, as well as subsectoral policies, those that are focused on specific subsectors, such as forestry, fisheries, livestock. Then we come to commodity value chains, like grain, small grains, beef. Then there are support services like research and extension. All those, cover the arena of policy. Agricultural policies are also strongly influenced by general macroeconomic policies, such as monetary and fiscal policies, foreign exchange systems, access to finance, and the interest rates. And these ultimately determine the viability and performance of the agricultural sector. There are also cross-cutting policies like devolution, which is very strong in Kenya and recently also in Zimbabwe, land governance, the issue of institutions, gender, youth, ICT and digitalization, mechanization, and environmental policies, which also have a profound impact on food and agriculture. Let's quickly look at the most commonly used policy instruments in Africa. Governments generally apply a wide range of policy instruments, and these refer to sets of measures and tools that directly or indirectly influence the food and agriculture sector and its subsectors. These policy instruments could be classified into the following 6 categories. We have production enhancing policy instruments, those that are geared directly at influencing production. Secondly, we have marketing, price, and the trade-related instruments. Then we have instruments for building resilience to climate change factors. Then we have specific commodity value chain. A lot of attention is given to developing specific value chain like sorghum, like millets, like beef, to target its production. Then, of course, the macroeconomic policies and the cross-cutting policy issues. The first group of policy instruments are those that directly influence production decisions. These include policies affecting tenure security of land, access to land, farm input distribution, and extension services. Marketing, trade, and pricing policies are those that affect the efficiency with which resources are allocated and the products move from farmer to consumer via the processing chain and also across borders. Commonly used instruments in this regard include input support programs, trade-related instruments like import and export bans and the trade barriers, and the price-related instruments. Currently, due to climate change, a lot of attention is being given towards measures to build resilience of productive sectors and they provide social protection and safety nets for affected consumers. We are also aware that legislative regulations, standards, and the statutory instruments are generally applied to back up and give effect to policy implementation. You set up a policy and then you back it up with legislation to support the implementation of that policy. Some policy instruments are used more frequently than others, while others are applied as and when necessary to respond to unforeseen situations, such as drought-induced food shortages, or in the recent past, due to COVID-19, there have been quite a lot of policy adjustments to respond to that crisis. This is what is referred to as periodic policy review, as determined by the prevailing circumstances. There are various ways through which policy changes are communicated to policy beneficiaries, because it's one thing setting a policy, but it's another thing getting the stakeholders to implement that policy. And these mechanisms vary from public policy announcements, press statements, media notices, policy review meetings, and the gazetting through government publications. What we have attempted to do, due to time, I will not be screening the small table where we have categorized the policy instruments according to each policy area, where we are saying when we talk of production enhancement policy area, we list a number of policy instruments that are used to influence production, such as input subsidies, which are very common across Africa, and they take different forms from direct free distribution to the e-voucher system, which is a partial subsidy, as explained by Professor Hamadi Boga. Then we have input support programs targeted for smallholder farmers. They come in various forms. If you want to promote production of small grains, some countries have distributed free seeds to allow the production to take place. Then, of course, extension policy has a direct effect on production. When you talk of marketing and pricing, there are many instruments that governments use, such as the setting of floor prices and or creating government-supported marketing channels and the use of tariffs and export bans. When we talk of building resilience as a policy area, there are many measures that are used by government, such as social protection and cash transfers, food relief, irrigation, and smart agriculture, including conservation agriculture, is being used to build resilience. Then, of course, we have nutrition and the food safety incentives that are used to build the nutritional resilience of consumers. Then the national food reserves are used quite commonly in many African countries. Then we come to specific commodity value chains, where we have seen deliberate efforts being taken by many governments to develop specific commodity value chains. Maize is very common in the Eastern African region. Small grains is very common in West Africa and increasingly in the drier areas of East and Southern Africa. A lot of attention is being given to promotion of horticulture as a specific value chain for export earnings. Livestock had been neglected, but it is now taking a center stage in terms of development of livestock-specific policies. There are also a lot of policies that are geared towards crop diversification to try to align production of certain crops into the correct ecological areas. You had the example from Prof. Oga there that maize has always been attempted in the wrong areas. So you come with policy to encourage and direct production of small grains and the more drought-tolerant crops in the correct agroeconomical areas. Then you talk of macroeconomic policies which have a fundamental effect on creating a conducive environment. And here exchange rates are very critical, interest rates, as well as tax incentives that government can use to promote certain commodities, to promote the importation of specific inputs. We have seen a relaxation of import duty on fertilizers and the chemicals and the products that go into farm production. So government has at its disposal very significant tools that it can use to influence decisions. And when we talk of the infrastructure of the cross-cutting policy issues that affect agriculture, infrastructure, which includes water infrastructure and road infrastructure, is very critical. When we talk of gender and the youth, we are focusing and encouraging gender responsive and the youth responsive policies to encourage agriculture due to the aging of the farming population in many African countries. Digitalization and technology is taking a lot of importance, as well as mechanization in many countries, and the devolution to ensure that policies reach directly to the beneficiaries that need to be assisted by those policies. In terms of our time, what are the processes that are generally used for effecting policy changes? Countries follow different but closely related processes for effecting policy changes. Policy implementation is a multi-stakeholder process that brings together the private sector, civil society, farmers, and government. Authorities at national level, in particular ministries of agriculture, are the ones responsible for spearheading policy formulation processes, for creating an enabling environment, and putting in place the necessary statutory instruments, and determining and assigning roles and the responsibilities between the many actors, as well as identifying suitable partners and networks for policy implementation. They also design monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, conducting actual M&E, and providing feedback on policy implementation. I think monitoring and evaluation of policy is very important so that reforms and refinements can be made where a policy has not worked. Finally, I can look at the recommendations to improve inclusiveness and policy effectiveness. The first recommendation is that there is need for consultative platforms where all the relevant stakeholders at various levels, that is national, provincial, and district, are brought together to ensure that they fully understand the policy instruments and they buy-in and to assign responsibilities for policy implementation. The second recommendation is that farmer and producer organizations should be viewed as key stakeholders within the national resource management and the policy and marketing policy system. This should also include building their capacity on the available input and output markets in the rural financial services. In other words, if you set policies, but you don't train and strengthen the capacity of farmers to implement those policies, that policy becomes invalid. Third recommendation is that within the implementing institutions, there's also need for wider consultations, including at the lower levels and at operational levels. That is, intersectoral collaboration and harmonization is equally critical at both the national and the provincial levels, given that food and agriculture policy cuts across many sectors and is influenced by other sectors. For example, if you talk of irrigation, irrigation requires power. Power is determined by a Ministry of Energy. If there is no harmonization of the provision of power while you want to grow irrigation, then the farmers will not have the water pumped into their irrigation system. So that harmonization is very important. There's also need for constant review of policy positions that is guided by facts and evidence. And the ministry have to address efforts to contribute to information and knowledge development and sharing within the agricultural sector. This calls for the establishment of a database of the key players in the agricultural sector. There is also a need to align policies to the continental guidelines, such as CAADP, Malabo Declaration, and AU Agenda 2063, and recently the Continental Free Trade Area, among other frameworks. And finally, there is need for strong and well-trained policy analysis teams who will help government to answer some of the many questions that are often affecting the policy development process. That what are the different policy instruments that could be given? What are the which instrument is better than the other? What are the cost implications of applying each policy instrument? What precisely will each instrument be designed to achieve? What needs to be done to make sure that these instruments will work? Do they have the capacity to do what is expected of them, and so forth? Conclusion. In summary, it can be stated that along with climatic factors, access to land, finance, and infrastructural issues, the policy regime has a great impact on food and agriculture performance in Africa. There are many policy instruments and measures that governments can apply to influence actions and investment decisions in agriculture, each with varying results and on production and food availability. The policy-making process is dynamic, responding to constantly changing economic and climatic factors. This calls for the need of strong capacity and consultative processes for regular policy analysis and review. There's now a lot of evidence on best practices and effective policy instruments that have worked well in many African countries, from which lessons can be shared. And I thank you for this opportunity. I hope I stuck to my 10 minutes, but I once again want to thank the organizers of this session and emphasize that without a good, conducive policy environment, we are not able to achieve the requirements of agriculture, and that policy is a tool that is very effective in influencing decisions towards smart agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for that insightful presentation. Indeed, you have highlighted a number of key instruments in policy, but also you have showed us how these instruments can be used and how they can also be able to guide the government in terms of whether there is progress, or also whether this is something that they would like to revise. So thank you so much for that insight. I am actually saying, if we have such a wealth of knowledge of policy, from instruments to the actual measurements, the actual application, where are we getting it wrong? We are constantly talking about food insecurity in most of these areas. We are constantly talking about malnutrition in most of these areas, and yet we have instruments like these. Where are we missing it? Can you highlight the places where we are really missing the point? And in your own experience, in Zimbabwe and across Africa, can you cite some examples of probably, countries where you think that they have really made right choices by applying these instruments? Over to you, Tobias.
Thank you. I'll answer the two questions. The first one, where we think we are missing it, I think from all this experience dealing with the policy. One area where we are missing it is in the consistency between those policy-making processes, that is the government, who are at the top echelon of determining policies, and the capacity of those who are expected to implement that policy. And that capacity is determined by the availability to financial services and capacity and ability to invest. As I always say, we have very good policies on paper that we want to achieve food security, and that we wanted to substitute import of the grains that we use. But to do that, you need to translate it into concrete action by ensuring that those responsible for producing that food and ensuring the food security are able to do so. But without that consistency between political statement and policy implementation, we are always going to be missing it. We need to ensure that the capacity of the private sector, of the farmers, is consistently supported. Where they need credit, they should be able to get it. Where they need power, fuel, and electricity, they need to get it. Where they need roads to transport their produce, they need to get it. But that gap of realization of what the intention of the political will and then the ability and capacity to turn that intention into reality has been a missing link. The second question on where we have seen good examples of policy instruments having an impact, I can cite my recent experience in Kenya with the e-voucher system, where partial subsidy is being given to farmers to go directly to agro dealers to procure the inputs they need, as opposed to previous system where blanket subsidies were being given without direct impact on the products they want to grow. So with the e-voucher system, you can direct or target the correct commodities that you want to be grown into a specific area. If you go to the ASAL semi-arid areas and you say you want them to grow small grains or sorghum or millets, you can make sure that that e-voucher system gives them access to the necessary seed that they require in order to grow those commodities. So there are many cases of success. The other success story I can see in Zimbabwe is the liberalization of the small grains market, whereby private millers and anyone is free to buy, process, and distribute the small grains, as opposed to a situation where only the grain marketing board or a single channel was responsible for distributing those commodities. So that liberalization of the market has allowed private investors to buy, process, and distribute the small grains. And we're already seeing quite an upsurge in the availability of sorghum, millets, and such commodities in the supermarkets, which never used to be the case. So I can cite those, but there are quite a number of success stories where policy instruments can and they have successfully affected or influenced the allocation of commodities to the correct users. Thank you.
Thank you very much.